Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, and welcome to a special episode with a special guest. I have Tim Durling joining me. We just did a video recently ranking the Alice Cooper Band albums. Tim's been here talking about some of his books, his Sammy Hagar book, his Kansas book. He's got a bunch of books out. If you put his name into Amazon, you'll see all the books that he currently has out. He also has a YouTube channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions. But we're not here to talk about vinyl. Tim's famous for his 8-track book, Unspooled, but we're not here to talk about 8-tracks. What are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about cassettes. Yes, cassettes. I don't know how old you are, Tim, but I think you're roughly around my age,
I'm
and
50.
you're 50. All right, you're
Yeah.
actually you're younger than me. But when I was growing up, cassettes were my media of choice. When I first started to get into music, I was buying records, but I pretty quickly flipped over into cassettes. I kind of wish I had continued to collect records, but uh, so we're going to talk about cassettes. We're going to talk about our memories of cassettes, our thoughts on cassettes. Tim has a bunch of cool cassettes he's going to share for us. So, yeah, cassettes. Like I said, for me personally, it was the format of my youth. And at the time, my logic with cassettes was, well, if I buy a vinyl record, I can't take it out and listen to it outside or in when I'm in my car in the car with my parents. And you could say, well, you could have had a blank cassette and recorded the record onto a blank cassette. Yeah, but that was an extra $2 that I had to spend on a blank cassette. And back then, money was really tight for me. So that was $2 that I could put towards another cassette. So yeah, cassettes were my format of choice. And admittedly, I very much got away from them like many people once the CD age kicked in. And then I sort of went back and started getting into vinyl. But lately, I found myself just sort of reminiscing, getting into cassettes again, thinking about them. I've bought a couple cassettes I'll show later. But Tim, what are your early memories and thoughts of cassettes? Did you grow up with them like I did?
Oh, absolutely, John. I mean, that was the format of choice for pretty much everyone I knew because so I was born in 74. I remember when 8 tracks were popular, so around the turn of the 80s, because I remember I'd be at my grandparents' house and cousins of mine would have things like Blondie in the Cars and Queen. So I remember 8 tracks, and of course I remember vinyl. But at a certain point, not just, I wasn't buying albums at this point, but my parents, my aunts and uncles, every house that I would visit, everybody had records, but nobody was buying new records. If it was a new album, it was on cassette. You'd see cassettes laying on the table or the cupboard
Hmm.
somewhere, and then around I think 83 was the first time I ever sat in a car that had a cassette deck in it.
Hmm.
And so that was another thing that kind of paved the way. I remember one thing in particular was the first time that I had an aunt and uncle that had one of those adapters that was shaped like an 8 track, but you'd lay a cassette down in it, put it in an 8 track player, and it would play the cassette.
Wow, I've never seen one of those. I've seen
Yeah,
it the other way with CD players when,
same idea, like
yeah,
same idea. So you'd and there's a picture of one in my unspooled book, and it was the weirdest thing. And I'm like, how does that work? Well, these things turn, and then these things turn, and it plays the tape. But that was
wow.
the first. That was sort of like when you had VHS switching to DVD, you'd get those
Yeah,
combo players for a while
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
somebody would be sitting there like, I've got a library full of movies on VHS. I don't want to replace them with DVDs. Of course, they became
yeah.
dirt cheap, and these things happen. Like we've seen format changes all over the place. But throughout the 80s, it was pretty much cassettes. And in my house, the only time that, we played records, we'd dig our old Christmas records out at Christmas
Hmm.
time and play them. That was about it. Now, I'm like you. I wish that when I started buying, I was buying records and keeping them in the
Yeah,
shrink wrap and stuff like
right,
that.
right.
But also, when I started becoming interested in music, past just recording songs off the radio onto blank tapes, you'd have your Walkman. I never had an actual Sony Walkman, but you'd have your little tape recorder
Hmm.
and the convenience. They were small. You could take them
Hmm.
with you. You could throw a bunch of them into like a little leather case or whatever. I used to have a little
Hmm.
like a briefcase thing that held
Yep.
like 30 tapes,
Yeah, I had that
and
too.
then smaller ones. I had all kinds of these different things. Or you'd have the carousel things that would turn
Hmm.
around. So yeah, I've got very fond memories. Most of the albums, the building block albums that I still love today, I heard them first on cassette. And it was really only around the turn of the 90s when CDs started to come up on my radar. I knew that there were CDs, but I wasn't really sure how they worked. I didn't know anybody that had a player. But once I found out that there were certain albums that, oh, there's an extra song on the CD that's not on the cassette,
Hmm.
well, I just thought that was annoying. Like, why would they do that? Um, and I have gotten rid of a lot of my tapes over the years, but I bought a lot of them back. As you can see behind me, those are all cassettes.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I like having all the formats that I can get. That's why I have the 8 tracks too, right? But yeah, definitely somebody that, I probably had over 300 cassettes by the time that I was, in my senior year of high school.
Yeah.
So I definitely grew up with them and on them.
Yeah, it's funny, two things. You mentioned your parents playing Christmas records. In my house, and I was a little bit older than you, so I do remember my parents had a stereo system that had an 8-track player and a record player on it. And I've
Yeah,
told this story on my channel. I had it, my dad's second youngest brother, who wasn't that much older, he was probably only 10 years older than me, probably in like 79, 80, he gave me a box full of 8 tracks, just because he was like, I'm moving on to cassettes. And it pretty quickly in our house, it flipped over too. So the only time records got brought out were my parents. I'm 100% Irish. So my parents had a bunch of like Celtic Irish
right.
records. So they would play Irish music on records, and they would play Christmas music
Yeah.
on records. And so I remember having that kind of memory. But yeah, and I don't have now. I'm sure it's because I didn't treat my cassettes probably the way I should have. I moved to Florida. Let me think about this. I moved to Florida 11 years ago, and when I moved down here, the minivan that I had at the time had a cassette player in it. And when I bought that car, gosh, I'm gonna say I probably bought that in like the mid 2000s or something, early 2000s. And it was like at that point where it was kind of like, yeah, this is like a weird thing for a car to have a cassette player in
Yeah.
it. It's
Yeah.
like the last, like, probably moment you could have gotten a cassette player in a common Honda Odyssey minivan that I
Yeah.
had.
I would have thought that would have been much sooner that they
No, it was a
stopped.
weird thing. Like
Yeah.
I probably had like I think it was a car that had been sitting on the lot for a year or something, and it was like this weird kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, this. Oh, sorry, this has a cassette player in it,
And
type of
meanwhile, you're
thing.
like, are you kidding me? This
Yeah,
is awesome.
exactly. And so what I did is I had just had a big box that sat between the seats, and I just had all these cassettes. Like I probably had like 40 cassettes, 50 cassettes piled up in there. And I would listen to these things, and that was kind of what I'd listen to in my car, even though I had obviously switched over to CD. By then, I had switched to CDs. Like I was kind of late to the CD thing. I'm gonna say it was like 93, 90, nah, a little earlier than that, probably like 91, that somebody gave me a quote portable CD player, which was like
Yeah.
this big clunky thing. But I was still buying cassettes because I didn't have a CD player in my car. So when I had that minivan, boy, I might have had a CD player and a cassette player in that car when I think back on it now, because there's no way I drove that for all that time with just a cassette player. I think I had a CD player and a cassette player in that car, which is really, in fact, I'm positive. That's now that it's all coming back to me now.
Wow.
But I used to just have this big box with all these cassettes in there, and I would play them. And probably because I was leaving it in my car all the time, and maybe the cassette player should have been tuned up or cleaned up or something, the tapes would get eaten after a while, and I'd have to, pull it out
Yeah.
and drag it out, and I would
Spaghetti.
just throw it out, and
Yeah.
I would just kept going through the box until I was eventually down to like 12, 15 cassettes that didn't even have the cases anymore. And I eventually was just like, you know what? I got rid of that car, which by the way, I left the cassette inside the car. I forgot that I had left the cassette in there. Got rid of the car, and I just had that box. Like I had about 12 cassettes left. They're the only survivors from my youth. And I was like, you know what? I just threw them in the trash because at that point I was already collecting vinyl. I had CDs and
Yeah.
I don't even think I had a like a dedicated CD player like in my stereo at that point. I think I had some sort of little CD cassette boombox thing. So I just got rid of them. So it's kind of a shame. Like they didn't quite, I mean, I'm sure if you take, it's just like anything else. If you take care of them, it can last forever. But I sort of beat them up a lot because I was taking them out in the car and everything like that. So they tend to
Well,
wear
yeah.
down kind of quickly.
Tape media will deteriorate. I mean, that's just, it's magnetic. They will wear away. But I do know one thing that I always used to make sure that I did. I always used to cringe when people would leave tapes. They wouldn't rewind them before they put them away. I always would make sure at least one side was rewound
Hmm.
because it's a fact. If you would leave a tape like halfway through a song, eventually you'd lose a bit of volume on that one part because
Interesting.
because the oxide would wear away. So yeah, they really weren't made to last. I mean, I don't have a player for these things anymore, but they bring back such nostalgia. Yet the artwork is small. You very
Yeah.
rarely do you get the back covers. Sometimes you
Yeah.
get hardly anything for credits, but it just
Yeah.
doesn't matter. I like the fact that they can be different colors on the spines of them. Like I grew up with these things, and it's funny because a lot of new albums are coming out, and cassettes are an option.
Yeah, I've done some research on this because I've tried to, like you, I didn't have a Sony Walkman when I was
Right.
younger. I just had like a Walkman. But I've been doing some research on, there's people out there that make Walkmans. And I bought
Mm.
one maybe like a couple years ago and it sounded horrible. There was all
Oh.
kinds of like if I didn't even have a tape in and I just pressed play and I had the headphones plugged into it, you heard the
Oh, it was
like the
noisy.
motor and all this
Yeah.
noise and it was super super noisy. It sounded terrible and I started researching it and apparently there's like some sort of mechanism that was in the original cassette players, cassette decks, portable cassette players that nobody makes anymore. That apparently I don't know what the deal is, but it's like some piece or something that nobody makes anymore. And because of this, any kind of modern cassette player that you buy now is not going to it's not going to be that good because some of the materials that they used early on just don't exist anymore. And the belts and everything that people use now are really cheap. And so the only thing you can really do is try to like I have actually it's out in the other room. I have a cassette deck thing that I bought like maybe 5 years ago. It's like from the 80s or something like
Hmm.
that. And
Yeah,
and it
good
works.
refurbished ones.
Yeah,
Yeah, good. Yeah.
exactly. You got to go
You
the
know,
refurbished routes. And
you
they do that for the Walkmans
yeah.
and
You bring up an interesting point because that might be what, sometimes you'd buy a cassette player of any kind, but one of the selling points on it would say low noise. And I
yeah.
always used to wonder what that meant, but I bet that's what it is. You don't get the mechanical
Yeah.
noise of the
Yeah, the
like
machines and
tapes are usually noisy. I mean, tapes by their name, they'd all have a little bit of tape hiss.
yeah.
There'd always be a little bit of that. But yeah, wow, that's interesting. But that must be what it meant when they'd say low noise or noise
Yeah, and I just
reduction.
think different like this cassette deck, I should have written down the model that I have. It's actually when I started sort of slightly getting back into this, I was surprised that the tapes weren't as noisy as I thought they were going to be. It does have the various Dolbys. It's got Dolby A, B,
Hmm.
C on it, but honestly, like if you remember, it just seemed like when you put the Dolby thing on, it just sort of cut the highs, too much
Yeah.
of the highs
I
out.
never
So
understood, like I wasn't savvy
yeah,
enough and never had the right equipment to say, yeah, well, if you've got this amp and you've got this,
yeah,
oh yeah, it'll sound every bit as good as a record or,
right.
like so.
Right. And yeah, so it's like the whole Dolby thing and like you said, from a sound quality side of it, they're lacking in the upper range because of the tape hiss. They would typically EQ it in such a way that there isn't a lot of the high end. The low end isn't as defined. But I gotta say there's still something because it's an analog format.
Hmm. Yeah.
Vinyl is an analog format, cassette is an analog format. when I listen to CDs or I listen to streaming, there's just this brightness to everything now that is fatiguing on the ears. I just really feel like it's fatiguing. And sort of revisiting, I've only got like about 10 cassettes here, but uh, revisiting some of these, it kind of reminded me of, that kind of sound before this like super trebly, bright digital sound. There is kind of something to it. Most audiophiles would laugh and they dismiss cassettes as being like, you know, flawed. They've got
Yeah.
a high noise floor because of the hiss, like you mentioned. The dynamic range on a cassette, as far as the frequencies and everything, is limited. But there is something to it. There is something to the sound of it, and I can
Yeah.
kind of understand how there's a little bit of a revival with this. You do see some people. I'm on a cassette collectors, I think it's called Reddit forum,
Yeah.
and people talk about it on there. And maybe it's because vinyl has gotten so expensive and, CDs kind of don't have the charm that there's something about cassettes. And like you mentioned, there's artists now releasing things on cassettes. Honestly, I don't know how good they sound. I'm guessing that they probably don't sound particularly good and they're just
No,
digital transfers.
it's just the visual of seeing a new album on in that format. You're right. I mean, you sacrifice a lot of the audio quality for portability. It's like when eight tracks were popular.
Hmm.
No, they didn't sound as good as records, but you could play them in your car. That
Yeah.
was, that's so cassettes are the same thing. You could take a ton of them with you, whereas they don't, yes, they can break, yes, they can be damaged, but they're not, they weren't as uh vulnerable, I guess, as cassettes just because or they were more vulnerable than cassettes just because they were so much bigger.
Yeah.
You could put cassettes in a like a case that had like
Yeah.
felt, it was a little bit. But and then there was just something about the tactile, putting a cassette in,
Yeah.
ejecting, pressing play, pressing stop, pressing eject. Like I did that so much.
Yeah.
If you had that, I remember one of the highest tech things I remember. My mother had this car, and this would have been about 91. It was probably not a 91. It was probably 2, 3 years old at the time, but the cassette, I thought it was the smartest thing I'd ever seen. If there was enough of a space in between
Ah,
songs, you could
yeah.
automatically forward to the next
I was
song.
gonna bring that up. Yeah.
But yeah, I would have thought. See, my car, I've got an old car. I drive a 2014 Ford Focus, and it was probably one of the last years they put CD players in cars
Yeah.
because I don't have any digital stuff. I just listen to physical media. So I get into somebody's car and oh yeah, I got this CD. Oh, you don't have a CD player. But also I remember in this would have been 1995 when I bought my first car. It was an 86 Grand Am and it had a cassette deck in it. And at that time I'd gotten rid of so many of my cassettes and replaced them with CDs. So I was hell bent on getting a CD player put in and I had to look everywhere to find somebody that could put a CD player in this old car.
Yeah.
And boy, once I did, I drove around everywhere listening to CDs. I just thought it was the best
Yeah.
thing ever.
That
But
was a thing. I remember
yeah,
my first car CD player. I like had to find somebody
yeah.
that could do this. And back then, CDs were a little temperamental in some of these players. Sometimes certain
I,
discs
I
wouldn't
can
play.
remember burned CDs would never play in my
Burned CDs
car
would never play in the
ever.
car. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're exactly right.
they'd play in anything else, but they'd never play in a car. It was
Yeah.
just a weird thing. But yeah, now I kind of wish like what was I in such a hurry about? I had still had plenty of cassettes to listen to, and they were starting to get really cheap. Like you could
Yeah.
buy them for really, really, really cheap. And really, you kind of still can because they don't go up the way that vinyl has gone up in
Yeah.
value for
Yeah. Yeah.
original, unless it's a kind of a rare, not too many pressed, or maybe
Yeah.
it's one of the last ones that came out in the 90s or something. It's on that
Yeah.
precipice. That happens sometimes, but for the most part, yeah, cassettes still are kind of they're still kind of looked down on, but at the same time, there is a retro cool happening with them because I don't know how many I'll see younger people and they'll have that cassette shape on, purses and
Yeah.
hats and things. They might not even know what it is. And
Yeah.
Last year, I had the pleasure of talking to an author named Rob Drew, and he actually wrote a book called Unspooled. But what his book was about was cassettes and how
Oh
cassettes
wow.
revolutionized like indie recordings and
Hmm.
how there was such a big deal with the government. Like you remember the whole home taping is killing
Yeah.
music, and
Yeah,
he
yeah.
talked about that, how there was supposed to be legislation put in place. It was almost like the Napster thing just 20 years earlier. It was really, really fascinating. It was a great discussion. It just made me realize that, you take the cassette for granted, but it made a lot of things possible that weren't possible with other media.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because we haven't even talked about that. The ability to record on your own. That was a huge, huge thing. I mean, you couldn't do that with eight tracks, or at least it was, I know that there were some eight track
They
players that,
made players
but it
and
was
they, and
really
they
rare. It was
made
a strange.
blank eight tracks, but I've never done it. But I like I said, I had cousins that would
Uh-huh.
make them up or record. But you kind of had to know how long the songs were.
Yeah.
So you're like, well, each one of these programs has like 8.5 minutes. So basically,
Yeah.
like two and a half songs.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
break the song up, and then you gotta bring it. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
definitely not so easy. And I remember cassettes were like that. You'd borrow a cassette from a buddy and you just hope that it would fit on one 60-minute cassette because that's all you had, right?
Yeah, and it was, another, you mentioned the eight tracks. So I had gone from my parents had the eight track player and the record player. And I remember with cassettes thinking like, oh, this is great. Like, you only have two sides. You don't have to
Hmm.
worry about the song ending and the ka-chunk,
Yeah,
and then it moves on to the next track. I thought that was super cool. You could record over them, like you mentioned. That was a real thing. Like I would sit and make these tapes of my favorite collections of my favorite songs that I could play in my car. I don't personally remember ever making a mixtape for a girl, but I used to do it for myself, and
yeah,
it was had to be a real thought out process because I didn't want like a bunch of dead space at the end of the tape.
right.
The best thing was like when you timed it just right so you could get as much music as you could on that 90-minute cassette tape. And then I could go out and, just put that in my car and have that run through all my favorite songs and everything. And I used to like, you're talking about sort of the tactile thing of putting it in. And I used to think it was really cool when I remember I had a Jimi Hendrix like a compilation and it was a double record on one cassette. So there was
Yeah.
a ton of like
Oh yeah.
cassette inside the
Yeah.
thing. And I always felt like, yeah, man, I'm getting like, this is real bang for my buck. AC/DC's If You Want Blood was kind
Yeah.
of longer than a normal
Yeah.
album.
Any double album, it was you could put it on one cassette. They held more.
Yeah,
And it's like eight tracks. If you pick up an eight track of, you know, if you pick up an eight track of Rush 2112 and then you pick up All the World's a Stage, it's All the World's a Stage is physically heavier
yeah,
because there's twice as much tape in it.
yeah.
And cassettes, I mean, when you could see the window of the cassette, yeah, like something like Fair Warning by Van Halen's a short little
Yeah,
album,
yeah, right,
but then
right.
you put in a double live album and it's like over half of the, yeah. And I used to get pretty good at repairing them too, back when if they had screws in them, like, they'd wind up and go in there and try and fix the tape that fit wound up. It was really a process, but they didn't wind up as much as 8 tracks did. Let's put it that way. They were made a little bit better than that.
Yeah,
But over time, even if they played, they'd you're right, they'd lose all the top end. They'd get really uh, um,
muddy and
muddy sounding, right?
yeah,
Or some cassettes, and this would drive me nuts because inevitably it'd be something I couldn't find on CD. You'd start to hear the screeching sound,
yeah,
and I used to that would just,
yep.
it's like I can't listen to this anymore.
The other big thing with cassettes, I remember, because I had was coming from eight tracks and records, and eight tracks specifically. My parents' eight track player, you could only fast forward. There was a fast
Yeah, eight.
forward button. There
You
was
could
no rewind
you could
button.
couldn't rewind 8 tracks. That's one of the reasons why they tried to keep each of the programs the same length because you couldn't
Yeah,
rewind them. But yeah, 8 tracks you could, or cassettes you could rewind them. Some players had auto reverse, so
yeah,
if you didn't even have to get up and change it, it would
yeah,
flip out. Yeah, as long
yep,
as there, like you said, a lot of space between one side to the other. But yeah, I can remember making up mixtapes for myself, and you'd have like, I don't know, a minute and 12 seconds or something, or you wouldn't sure, but you'd like, I don't know, it's not much. So I'd put like Van Halen's Spanish Fly or something, a little instrumental piece on there. So at least it would be filled with something.
yeah,
I, there's a, I know I used to I started off so many mixtapes with, The opening track from Journey's Evolution album is an instrumental
Uh-huh.
called Majestic.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
I used that all that.
Whoops, I think I lost you there for a second. Yeah.
I used to start off so many of my mixtapes with the ding diddle ding diddle
Yeah.
ding.
What a great
I loved
intro.
I loved that little introduction. That would start out, and I used to end a lot of them if I had enough space with sung "Little Boy Blues" by Triumph on Thunder Seven because that was like the last song on that album, and I was like, okay, this is the last. There's I used to do a lot of ones with instrumentals on them
Yeah.
because I'd do Swish 625 by Def Leppard, Mr. Scary
Hmm.
by Doc, and I remember all those, and I used to play video games. I'd have a buddy over, I'd put the instrumental tape on, and we'd just turn the sound down on the TV and play Atari or Nintendo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's funny how you remember these little they seemed like such technological advances. Like I can rewind,
yeah,
I can rewind the tape. Wow, I don't have to go fast forward. Oh my gosh, this tape player, when you get to the end, it flips to the other side. This is sci-fi. It seemed like it
yeah.
was such a cool thing. Speaking of the blank space at the end of tapes, if I had a real cassette, like a store-bought cassette with music on it, if there was empty space on the end of it, I would record myself saying, "This tape belongs to John. If you find it, please return it to me at,
Oh,
the name of my school and everything or
that's
whatever I used to say on it." So sometimes I laugh and wonder if one of those cassettes somehow landed up at some store, used store somewhere, and somebody's
I
going to
bought
buy this, get
tapes.
get
Yeah,
to the end of Let There Be Rock, and they're going to hear this squeaky little
yeah. They're like,
11-year-old
what
voice.
is
Yeah. Man,
freaks?
this tape belongs to John, and if you
Freaks.
find it, please give it back to me.
Well,
Goodbye.
I never did that. I used to write my name and phone number inside everything that
Yeah.
I could. But you reminded me of something, and I've told this story before, but every once in a while you'd get the tape wouldn't be the exact order that the record was in.
Hmm.
They usually would be. They weren't like eight tracks, but they usually would be. But every once in a while they'd rearrange a song or two, or sometimes side one and side two were
Hmm.
reversed. But I remember the first time when I first got the first Van Halen album. So this would have been like 88. And I thought that the last song on side one of that album was called I'm the One on Fire. I thought that was the name of that song. And normally, when an album would get done, I'd be right over there, fast forward, flip the tape over. But I was hanging posters up. So I was standing on a kitchen chair, hanging a poster up on my wall. And all of a sudden, down, 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 down. And I'm like, what is that? Like, and it was like the fifth time I'd listened to the album. And I'm
Wow.
like, there's another song. And then I realized the song's called On Fire. And I always just thought it was I'm the One on Fire. If it was any other song title, I would have known, but it seemed like one song title to me.
Awesome. More innocent days. Well,
Yeah.
another thing, and let's get into showing some of our cassettes here. I've started to buy some cassettes again, and what I've been doing is I've been buying things that are not available on vinyl, or
Mm.
if they are, they're super, super expensive. For
Yeah.
instance, this is the second Badlands album, Voodoo Highway. It was released, I think, in 90 or 91,
91, I think. Yeah.
and it's super expensive. It was only released I think it might have only been released in Europe on vinyl, so the vinyl
Probably
is super
by then.
expensive. It's never been reissued. It's like $200 or $300 for a vinyl copy of this. $7 for the cassette,
Yeah.
and it's an analog format. That's the way I'm looking at it. Like, okay, these are things that I'm not going to buy it on vinyl. If I'm going to get a physical copy of it, I want some analog format. So I got this on cassette. I have another one too that was never released on vinyl.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
appreciate this.
Oh
We've
yeah. Yeah.
Night Ranger live
Do
in
you know
Japan.
where that came from?
Mm-mm.
I didn't know this till a few years ago. They put out a laser disc
Oh
called
wow.
Japan in Motion.
Speaking of like
So
odd
it's
old
so it's
formats.
so it's a so it's a full length concert. And all MCA in the States did was take the audio from it and put that out because I remember
Wow.
finding that in the store, and I'd only just gotten into Night Ranger, and I wasn't expecting to see anything else by them because they'd broken up, and Jack Blades was in Damn Yankees. But I remember seeing that. I'm like, what's that? And I love Man in Motion. It's got so many songs
Yeah,
from that
yeah, it's a
album on
great
it.
era
But
from the band.
yeah, you're right. It's not on vinyl now. 90 was about the cutoff for North America to put out vinyl. There's some in 91, but not
Hmm.
very much. But you're right. If it was only ever released, like if you try to get something like Skid Row Subhuman Race on
Yeah,
vinyl, that you're paying big bucks for that. I mean, if you know anything about the Badlands story, there's a reason those things aren't
yeah,
getting
yeah,
reissued.
exactly. Yeah,
But you're right. All you're ever going to get are used whatever format
yeah,
they are.
used CD or, and
Yeah.
then there's stuff like this, Nemesis, which was the early version of Candlemass that this was only released, so like demos and stuff like that. This was released
Yep.
recently. This is like a sort of a reissue thing. So I have something like that. This was a band that I was in, and the label put out
Ah.
a cassette of it, Majesty and Ruin. It's a doom metal, epic doom metal thing. My buddy Rich, he's an amazing singer. And then I just have a couple handful of like Iron Maiden somewhere in time. This by this time when cassettes were coming out, you mentioned like this was the typical cassette you got
Yeah.
like in the early 80s, right? The cover doesn't even take up the full thing. At least they filled the space with like the name. Sometimes all you got was like a, tiny little cover, or you got this where the song titles are down here
Yeah.
because of the shape of the cassette, it was like, for them to sort of put the cover on there. And these are the type of clamshells, right? Isn't that what they call these
Yeah.
things? That I remember the most, these white ones. Like these were for me more late 80s, these sort of
Yeah.
clear.
I
Uh,
remember when they first and they came out with them in the States first, those clear colored cassettes. I thought those were
yeah.
the coolest thing that you could see through them.
Yeah, and so by the time you got to here, like to this, you get this big sort of fold out
Yeah.
thing.
Yep.
It's got the lyrics inside, which you need like a microscope
Ma-
to read them. They're
I
so tiny.
I look at those now and I go, how was I ever able to read these? And the only reason that there's some that I can still read now is because I know what it says.
Yeah, exactly. It's like our younger eyes were able
Yeah.
to handle it. But
Yeah.
all right, so you got a couple things too that you wanted to show.
Yeah, I wanted to show. So these, I got thinking about what are the oldest cassettes that I have, and not necessarily old, but old from the fact that when I bought them, I've still got them. Um, this one here, this Canadian 2112 cassette,
Wow.
and I bought this just at the beginning of my summer vacation at the end of grade eight, and this one's gotten a lot of use. Like the song titles are all worn off of this. I played
Wow.
this all the time, but this is the first time I heard 2112 was
Oh,
this
and it's
cassette
on
here.
a black clamshell
It's on,
thing there.
yeah.
That's
So it's Canadian.
interesting.
Yeah, the Canadian cassettes tended to be at
Oh,
a
really?
certain point. Yeah, they tended to be black.
Okay. Yeah, because
Um,
that's something I don't remember ever
and
having any that were like that.
and a couple I bought when they were brand new. One Van Halen OU812, which may have been the first clear cassette I ever bought.
Wow.
I just thought these looked classy, and the Canadian ones looked totally different. The J cards were the same, but the cassettes themselves looked
Yeah.
different. Bon Jovi, New Jersey. This was the first album I was actively waiting for to come out as a new fan, and of course, again, the clear cassette as opposed to the black cassettes that would have been in Canada. And you're right. By this time, you did get the
Yeah.
fold out, the lyrics, which yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Now you need a magnifying glass to even read them. But or another thing that some albums would do. Well, they did take some liberties with this one. They elongated it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or they would do it,
Yeah.
sideways. Um, couple, I got some really old ones here that came in these slip cases, but they're hard plastic slip cases. So this is Fleetwood Mac's album, Then Play
Oh,
On from
wow.
1969. It's got a
Yeah.
sticker on this hard, like that's a hard plastic case.
So how does that
Uh,
open up? Show
so the
me.
tape is kind of held in here via friction
Yeah, hold it
and
up a little bit higher.
okay.
We can't see it.
So
Yeah.
they cut you can kind of hear
Oh, wow.
like if I hold it like that,
Yeah.
it won't come out. There's a point where you reach, it's loosened up enough. And all of these cassettes that I've ever seen have this really tiny little window.
Oh, wow. I don't think I've
So,
ever seen one like that.
so they made these up until about 1976, and it tended to be of the Warner labels, but not necessarily. So I've got another one here, Deep Purple, Purple Passages, which is one of the many compilations of their Mark
Yeah.
One era. So that's what the Warner Brothers. They had the big one and the two, and the cassettes
Yeah.
kind of look like that too. So this one too, you have to uh, work to get this thing out. And again, it's got the small window in it.
Wow. Interesting.
And an artist we just finished talking about not too long ago, Alice Cooper, Muscle of Love. So again, this is another Warner Brothers one,
Mm.
and looks like that. And the last one I've got is the only one that's not a Warner Brothers. It's on a label called Big Tree. It's the second April Wine album.
Wow.
So this one's a different color. This is a looks like that.
Yeah, with like a label
Yeah. So these
printed
were
on, put
I
on
don't
top.
remember seeing these when I was a kid. Nobody I
Yeah,
knew
neither
had
do
these,
I.
and I think they only made them in the States, but they were this really hard plastic, but it was like a slipcase before there were slipcases. Um, so another thing I've got, people will remember these, a cassette single.
Yeah.
So this is Rush, Ghost of a Chance, and it's an American one. And it's got, so on side one of this thing, so it's got Ghost of a Chance, Where's My Thing, both of those from Roll the Bones. And then on side B, it's an interview with a DJ named John Derringer at Q107 in Toronto. So it was an interview with the group that's about, let's see, how long is the interview? Six something? I can't tell what it says. Getty, Alex, and Neil talk about the new album, Rush, and their future. So that was kind of cool. And sometimes you'd get B-sides on these, of course.
Yeah.
But I used to have a ton of these, but most of them were absolutely useless because very few of them had anything on the B side that wasn't just an album
Right.
track.
Right. And
Um,
sometimes they'd even give those away for free, like because cassettes were sort
there'd
of
be
cheap.
like
They'd be
at
promo things at the
yep,
counter at the
yep.
record shop
You'd buy
or
anything here, have
yeah,
this. Yep.
exactly. Right. And
So
they could do that with cassettes like CD singles never really worked, but with at least a cassette single, you just put the however much tape you needed inside
yeah,
it. It
with
wasn't
the
like a
CD, it was like you're wasting so much space
exactly.
just putting a song or two on them,
Yeah,
and I
exactly.
think people kind of knew that, and you're
Yeah.
only what you're paying for is graphics, is
Yeah,
if there were
exactly.
any. So this one tape here, I've always been fascinated by this because you already held up a Night Ranger cassette, but as most people know, through most of their albums in the '80s, they were on MCA Records. So a buddy of mine found this, and he says, I remember this. He came to school and said, I found the weirdest thing in my uncle's uh, attic. He said he had a bunch of old tapes up there. If I wanted them, I can have them. And he said, I got this Midnight Madness tape on CBS. I'm like, CBS? So,
Mm,
so this is a Canadian cassette. This is what CBS cassettes looked like in Canada in the '80s. They had the chromium dioxide. I did a whole
yeah,
episode
yeah.
dedicated to these kind of cassettes. But Midnight Madness was originally on Epic when it first came out in Canada.
Interesting.
So, and that's what the tape looked like.
Wow.
So that's kind of an oddity. I don't think it's particularly rare, but it's just kind of a weird. This is a really old tape, Queen Sheer Heart Attack. This is, I don't know if it's an original, but it's pretty old. It's an old Canadian cassette on Elektra
Yeah.
Records, and it's got this sticker on it. It says manufactured and distributed by WEA Music of Canada.
Wow.
And whoever owned this had a label maker, so they made their own label that just says Queen SHA for Sheer Heart Attack. And you
Probably when
know
they
what?
stored it on their
Yeah.
shelf, it
And
helped
you know a
things.
tape's old when it has a sticker on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know what
And
used to always have the stickers on them was like if you bought like you know, reading the Bible, Charlton Heston reads
oh
the
yeah,
Bible,
yeah, yeah,
on 8 cassettes.
yeah,
It
yeah.
would have
They'd
like
have
the
stickers.
cassettes
Yeah,
inside like a plastic thing, and the
yeah.
cassettes all had like a sticker sort of label on them.
Speaking of which, I was pretty excited to find this because when I first found this in 1995, it was the first time I'd found this album with the original cover on it because
Wow.
people forget that prior to the remasters, if you got into Kiss later, you could not find this original cover.
Yeah.
So this is a Canadian Casablanca cassette, and that's what the polygram cassettes used to look
Oh
like.
wow, I like that. The
Yeah.
front of that cassette. Yeah.
And then another thing, which is kind of funny, this is a Canadian cassette of Kill 'Em All on Bonsai Records, which is distributed by Polygram in Canada. So Metallica actually had major label distribution in Canada before they did in the States, and this is what the cassette looked like.
Oh, cool.
So pretty hard to find because usually what you find is the Electra version. But yeah, that's just a handful of cassettes I
Yeah,
think were kind of unique.
that's awesome. All right. Well, there you go. Here's a little trip down memory lane with cassettes. I know that a lot of people out there are in our age bracket, so I'm sure you have some experience with cassettes. If not, that might have been your format of choice when you were younger. So let us know what memories you have cassettes. Do you still listen to cassettes? I know I have some people that leave comments on my channel that are collectors of cassettes. So let's hear from you, all you cassette fans out there. Let's hear from you. Let's share some of your memories of cassettes. Maybe if you have some odd cassettes or unique cassettes that you still have in your collection or that you've come across, let us know in the comments down below. Okay. I'd like to thank Tim for joining me here at the Lair. Make sure you check out Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Make sure you type his name into Amazon so you can get all the books that he has out. And Tim will be back here on the channel. I'm sure he always has cool, fun stuff coming out, new books and things like that. So I'm sure we'll see Tim again here at the Lair. So thanks again, Tim, and thanks to everybody out there. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. Till we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.